Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. I'm Bob Ellison, President of the Society. We are a scholarly organization which publishes primary documents on early American history. We also host a graduate student forum every year for promising graduate students in early America. And we are a collegial group, as I think you are learning. And welcome you all here for this special program tonight. We have two distinguished guests who have been doing a really extraordinary project. John Slater grew up actually in Haverhill and has lived for more than 20 years in Andover, where he has been affiliated at Phillips Academy. And he is an anthropologist, archaeologist. He actually has feet in two worlds, the 17th century and the Mayan world of the Yucatan. I think you may be our first speaker who speaks Yucatan.
Yeah.
As well as mine. You just say a familiarity with mine. Earned his doctorate at Brandeis in archaeology and anthropology, and he's been affiliated with the Robert Peabody Institute of Archaeology, and he also has led numerous expeditions and learning programs in Mexico, Belize, Peru, and the American Southwest, as well as New England. And actually, he had a much longer biography, so I know I'm leaving out a lot of important things, including his wife is here, who is a fifth grade teacher, and their two daughters. They all live happily in Andover.
Thank you.
And Christy Potroff is a English professor at Boston College. She earned her doctorate at Fordham University, and she has a book in progress called Postal Hackers. Sounds like an extraordinary story about some 19th century outsiders who hacked the U.S. postal system. And she has published a variety of articles on figures ranging from Benjamin Franklin and Harriet Jacobs to Walt Whitman and Phyllis Wheatley in American literature, early American studies. So welcome. And we'll find out how these two, one 19th century literary world, another from the world of the Yucatan, got together in Andover to talk about Anne Bradstreet. And the Bradstreet project has been generously funded by Boston College, and it received an Academic Technology and Innovation grant and an Ignite grant from the Provost's office. So thank you to Boston College for sponsoring this, and thank you to Don and Christy for undertaking the project. So I will turn this over to you.
Thanks
Wonderful.
so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Welcome. Thank you for being here tonight. This has really been something we've been looking forward to. We do want to start off with a number of thank yous. I don't think there's ever too many thank yous, but we certainly have quite a number of them. So we'll start off first with Harry and Karen Asnoyan for being incredible stewards of the property and opening up their home to our research group and truly becoming part of the team. Harry's historical research and the compilation of materials he gathered over the years has been invaluable to our work.
We're also grateful to Karen for her kindness and hospitality. Hello, Karen. And her perceptive attention to the house. Her knowledge that it is saturated and haunted by the past. What a true joy it has been to get to know the Asnoyan family, whose primary mission is to heal and empower others. So thank you for letting us dig a huge and inconvenient hole in your yard.
A huge thanks to Mark Agostini, who, while juggling PhD studies, has been a key part of the team for the past 2 years, perhaps most critically guiding volunteers through the learning process of digging and cultivating a team of budding archaeologists.
We are also enormously grateful to Isabella Connor and Jacques Denault, writers and historians who joined our team last fall. Thanks to their passion, time, and well-balanced efforts, we moved more dirt than we ever would have expected, and their golden trowels unearthed most of the things that are on this table here. A special thank you also to Rebecca Mitzine, my colleague from Boston College, who helped us never lose sight of the magic, and for being the most meticulous with the trowel. We have the tiniest little pins. And a thank you to the past and present staff of the digital studio at Boston College, including Antonio Lopiano, Ashlyn Stewart, Melanie Hubbard, and Matt Naglack for helping us dig and for making digital renderings of our progress.
Okay, and thank you to Sebastian Altomer Floyd Greenwood, who is here tonight, and Steve Roy for the contributions at the site. And thanks to Ben Osgood for cheering us on at the dig every day. Thank you to Javier Urcid, who for even a decade after serving as my dissertation advisor remains the most influential of mentors and friends. For Elvis Dominguez Covarrubias, for now the third time serving as the incredibly talented project artists for one of my studies.
We are also grateful to the past and present staff of the North Andover Historical Society, and particularly Carol Majahad, Director Emerita, who was integral to our earliest collaborations. Thank you to Robin Siegel, David Blauvelt, and Rio Sabella for their support and collaborative spirit.
Many thanks to the talented archaeologists and architectural historians that we have worked with. First and foremost, my dear friend Tad Baker. Tad, you've been a long and much treasured mentor for, my goodness now, 20 plus years, I suppose, over at the Peabody Museum. You've been invaluable, your support for the Bradstreet project, and I really can't tell you how much we've enjoyed working with you and having you make site visits and guiding us with various questions along the way. Thanks for also in order to Bob Chartrand and the Dendro team as well at Oxford, Daniel Miles, Michael and Virginia Cuba, Michael Burry, and Benjamin Nutter. Thank you to my Phillips Academy students and my daughters Quinn and Maeve for washing artifacts. It needs to happen. We have lots more if anybody's looking for something to do. Phillips Academy administrators for approving my sabbaticals to facilitate fieldwork, and Metacela Ramos and the rest of the History and Social Science Department for supporting it.
And thank you to Boston College and Merrimack College for funding this research, and to my colleagues at both institutions, including Paul Lewis, who's joining us here tonight, for their ongoing support and encouragement over the past few years. I'm also grateful to my former students and colleagues at Merrimack College, especially the 8 students who participated in the Bradstreet Research Fellowship Program 2018, 2019, and the poets who contributed new work in response to Bradstreet. We're also grateful to literary scholars Elizabeth Bannock Dillon, Ivy Schweitzer, and Charlotte Gordon for their support of this work and for spending time with us on the site. And to Sari Edelstein and Joe Rezik for coordinating an earlier conversation at the Harvard Mahendra Center on American Literature. We are likewise grateful to our families for serving as a cheering section for this project, and especially Beth, who is here with us today, and Laura, who's in Italy right now. And finally, we thank the Colonial Society, everyone here, for giving us the opportunity to share this research this evening, to Bob Allison and Anne Cesare, especially, for facilitating this event.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Anne Dudley Bradstreet first turned to poetry during a period of serious illness when she was 19 years old, a young settler in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Bradstreet's earliest extant poem, Upon a Fit of Sickness, Anno 1632, describes the agonies of illness in ballad meter and dramatizes her close encounter with the spiritual realm. Quote, "My race is run, my thread is spun, lo here is fatal death." Informed by such hard-earned experiences with illness, she laments the human condition in which bodies suffer and die too soon. Quote, "O bubble blast, how long canst last, that always art a-breaking. No sooner blown, but dead and gone, even as a word that's speaking." End quote. By the poem's end, however, she makes peace with life's transience and commits herself to the divine and earthly ordinances of the Puritan God. Quote, "The death's arrest I shall count best, because it's thy decree." End quote. Anne Bradstreet's most powerful works draw readers close to the evocative textures of her everyday life as a woman and mother in the 17th century. In the thread of life and the burst bubble of death, Bradstreet's imagery and illusions adhere to the textures of the home and are set in line and meter to explore the most human expanse, the terrain between the flesh and the spirit. She would eventually recover from this and many other illnesses, but her propensity to write poetry during life's most difficult and perilous passages would endure until her death 40 years later. Anne Bradstreet wrote most of her poems from the remote frontier settlement of Andover, now North Andover, Massachusetts, nearly 30 miles north of Boston. During these years, she lived a full life. She mothered 8 children, ruled the domestic realm, and worked to maintain community in the settlement, writing poetry all the while. Her husband Simon nurtured her capacities as a poet, and some of her most renowned poems speak to their passionate relationship. Poetry wasn't simply an intellectual or literary pursuit for Bradstreet, but a spiritual one, in which poems are, quote, ladders to God, like prayers, end quote, as her biographer Charlotte Gordon writes. Anne Bradstreet is sometimes regarded as America's first poet, which is kind of an oversimplification, but her 10th muse, lately sprung up in America, or several poems compiled with great variety of wit and learning, full of delight, was the first book of poetry to be published by a North American author. Enormously far-ranging, the 10th Muse dramatizes the rise and fall of long-lost empires in the poem The Four Monarchies. The Four Humors of Man theorizes the emergent concepts from early modern science, and a dialogue between Old England and New poses a complex diplomatic negotiation. The book also includes poems dedicated to important individuals, Queen Elizabeth I, Sir Philip Sidney, and her own father, Thomas Dudley. The 10th Muse is bold and bombastic, highly formal, yet rough-hewn. The book made Anne Bradstreet a literary celebrity during her lifetime and put her name on bestsellers lists alongside works by William Shakespeare, John Milton, and John Donne. Though Bradstreet and members of her family claim that the 10th Muse was published without her knowledge or permission by her brother-in-law, John Woodbridge, literary scholars have found evidence of her active participation in the book's publication and understand this story to be a strategic fiction. She was an ambitious thinker, a bold writer, and a woman in a patriarchal society. This story provided the cover she needed to become a published poet. Read and renowned in North America and Europe, her work was ballast for the Massachusetts Bay Colony and for Puritanism, as it conferred legitimacy upon the settler colonial project by proving that America could produce a poet and knit together a community of readers drawn to her voice and vision. Beyond her published work, many of Bradstreet's later poems were written for family members and in response to death or trauma, such as Verses Upon the Burning of Our House, July 10th, 1666, in memory of my dear grandchild, Elizabeth Bradstreet, and the poems written during her husband's extended absences. These poems, literary scholar Ivy Schweitzer writes, quote, operate on several levels at once, managing to be thoroughly conventional and subtly subversive at the same time, end quote. Bradstreet's poems have long been celebrated for their subtleties and duplicities, and the robust available archive of both published and unpublished poetry has contributed to her canonical status in American literature. With Bradstreet's poetry, we have an unparalleled archive of both print and manuscript writing from an early American woman. As a woman in a tightly orchestrated Puritan world, Anne Bradstreet turned to poetry to explore life's ambiguities and ambivalences, and to envision the world anew. Simon, her dear and loving husband, was one of the most powerful colonial-era officials of his generation. During the years of their marriage, he served as a judge in the Essex County courts. As a sitting judge, he sometimes used the courts to advance his own mercantile interests. He was a member of the controversial Atherton Trading Company, a private land speculation syndicate coordinated by colonial officials, including John Winthrop, designed to strategically dispossess the Narragansett and Neantic tribes of their lands. In Andover, in 1644, 2 years before the land was officially open for settlement, Simon established a sawmill to make money and the raw materials to construct a new settlement. 2 years later, in 1646, John Woodbridge, the same man who took Anne's book to England for publication, conducted an oral land transaction with Coochamakin, a sagamore of the Massachusetts tribe, and purportedly traded the land for £6 and a coat. Literary scholars have long known Woodbridge as the kind of man who misrepresents transactions brokered through his hands. This story and the transaction should likewise be understood as a strategic fiction of politically and economically motivated men. As for Simon Bradstreet, he was both dear and loving husband to Anne, the subject of passionate love poems, the husband who traveled for work. He was also a singular force in colonial Massachusetts. He wielded an extraordinary amount of power as Secretary of the Colony, a judge in Essex County, as one of the wealthiest merchants in New England. He was sent on a number of diplomatic missions, meeting with kings and royal officials as a representative from America. In 1679, he became the governor of the colony, a position he held off and on for over a decade. There has been no thorough biography of Simon Bradstreet, and much of what literary scholars know about him comes from Bradstreet's poetry. We might consider the ways her poetry has served as enduring spin control for Simon's often harsh and brutal political and judicial careers. He was an enslaver. He had a direct hand in indigenous land dispossession and enslavement. Women and Quakers were tried for being in league with the devil in his Essex County courts. He organized a coup to reclaim the governorship and forbade the publication of newspapers during his reign. His accumulation of wealth, land, and power was truly extraordinary. So this evening, we're opening the door to the Bradstreet North Andover homes and invite you to think through our research, our material findings as research in progress, and to consider joining in our efforts to preserve and further study these important colonial era homes. We will present to you features and findings from what we believe to be Anne Bradstreet's 2 North Andover homes, the burned foundation of the house destroyed by fire, as well as elements of the second replacement house, which still stand on the property today. The site is extraordinary for its complexity. Beyond the circumstances on the ground, the site has a wealth of written texts attached to it, the land deeds and historical records connected to Simon's bookish work for the colony, and Anne's published and unpublished poetry written from these spaces. In fact, her poem, Verses Upon the Burning of Our House, July 10th, 1666, and that date played a crucial role in our interpretation of the site. The date of her house fire, her ability to capture the scale of the loss in language, has helped clarify the chronology of the site, and is what first drew our attention to what to look for, because burned houses don't simply disappear. The site opens up new terrain for understanding Bradstreet's poetry, the first period of European settlement in New England, and the lives of women and underdocumented people from the past. The colonial house was a space of comfort, designed to cultivate and shelter the family, a private place for sex and intimacy, as we know from Bradstreet's poetry. But in the settler colonial world, the house was also a site of power and privilege, and one that served and protected the Bradstreet family, but was also host to many other residents, enslaved people, indentured servants, and guests, and was designed to exclude and limit others still. We have recovered the crucial setting for her poetry, and from this vantage, we can see more clearly what falls outside of the purview of her books. Though Bradstreet and her poetry brought us to her doorstep, it has become very clear to us that the site was home to dozens of other less documented people. These houses were sites of colonial authority and power. While Bradstreet's poetry was oriented to the heavens and towards her children, she hardly sets her gaze on the other humans living their lives in the same house. Our research has recovered the names of the indentured servants, John Carr, William Young, Alexander Sessions, and the enslaved Africans, Jack, Galionota, Stacy, Hannah, and Bilha, who shared houses with the Bradstreet family and lived lives of intimate interdependence. Reading the houses meticulously, with great care and imagination, brings the world of the 17th century colonial life into sharper focus. Here, in North Andover, the history of settler colonialism, its hierarchies and violent exclusions, is so close at hand, you can reach out and touch it.
We're going to switch around a lot.
But thank you.
The house and its structural features. The local communities of Andover and North Andover have long been interested in the whereabouts of the 17th century homes of Simon and Anne Bradstreet. As early as the 19th century, what is now known as the Parson Barnard House on Osgood Street in North Andover was cited as the home that the Bradstreets secured for themselves after their earlier home burned in 1666. In 1960, the Stevens Foundation and the North Andover Historical Society even purchased the house as such. But shortly thereafter, early American architectural historian Abbott Lowell Cummings' study of the property determined that it was built circa 1715. This late date disqualified the house as the Bradstreets, given that a replacement would have been built closer to 1666. Furthermore, Anne died in 1672 and Simon in 1697. The same year that the Historical Society purchased the home, local avocational archaeologist Forbes Rockwell embarked on an investigation across from the Parson Barnett house on land that deeds indicate was once owned by the Bradstreets. His goal was to find the remains of the structure that Anne immortalized in her poem Verses Upon the Burning of Our House, July 10, 1666. After digging test pits off and on for parts of 3 years, Rockwell discovered a hearth, but became disillusioned after unearthing 2 early 18th century coins during the excavation. Feeling that the hearth was thus too late to belong to the Bradstreets' burned home from 1666, and seemingly meeting resistance from the owners of the land where he was working, Rockwell ultimately abandoned the dig in 1963. Thus, along with the misidentified Parson Barnett house, this attempt to identify one of the Bradstreet homes had likewise been met with disappointment. Indeed, decades later, in 1990, Cummings remarked that, quote-unquote, the question of what happened to the house in which Anne Bradstreet lived would make an interesting, though perhaps futile, study, end quote. Cummings was likely referring mostly to the Bradstreets' first home in the quote, since in his encyclopedic 1979 study of early Massachusetts architecture, he mentions the summer beam of the circa 1666 Bradstreet home. In 2019, guided by Carol Majahad of the North Andover Historical Society, we learned about the summer beam and that it is located in what is now the 2-car garage of the 1749 Phillips Manse in North Andover. This is where our project started, with a desire to investigate the structure. Majahad then facilitated a meeting with the most gracious and accommodating current owners of the property, Harry and Karen Asnoyan. During this meeting, Harry described what he believed to be 17th century building material comprising the majority of the garage structure. We listened to descriptions of posts, beams, and other structural elements. What most caught my attention, however, was his description of a door in the garage. Harry shared that the door had been covered with centuries-thick layers of paint that he recently stripped. Once completed, he claimed that a carved motif was revealed in the door. With my actively having another research project in progress, inspired by Tad Baker, that is investigating apotropaic counter-magic folk signs in New England, I quickly asked Harry if the sign he revealed was a circle with a 6-petaled rosette within. He surprisingly verified that it was, in fact, that shape. We had heard enough and requested a viewing of the structure at once, to which they fortunately agreed. In June of 2019, we got our first glimpse of the building. Upon entering what, from the outside, appears to be nothing more than a typical 2-car garage, the age of the building was quickly apparent with its massive posts and beams, along with wide pine wall sheathing, and the door that Harry described. Closer inspection revealed a variety of tantalizing features that begged further investigation of the structure to determine if it might be old enough to be the remnants of one of the Bradstreet houses. First, the massive summer beam was finely crafted to include lamb's tongue chamfering, a hallmark of 17th century Massachusetts architecture, particularly of the variety befitting a stately home such as would have been occupied by the Bradstreets. The door, as advertised, appeared to be quite early and indeed featured a daisy wheel prominently carved at its center. We will discuss the door in more detail later in this talk. Major structural elements of the garage, such as beams and girts, appear to have been moved, recycled, or refitted, since joist and stud receiving pockets are misaligned with the current orientation of the members. Lastly, some structural elements, most notably rafters, still exhibited tree bark. This final observation made a dendrochronological or tree ring dating investigation seem like a viable option. In November of 2019, and again in 2021, we hired Daniel Miles, proprietor of the Oxford Dendrochronology Lab, to partner with us to investigate the garage, Phillips Manse, and the Parson Barnett house. In 2021, samples taken at the Parson Barnett house determined that the structure was built in 1711, which showed Cummings' earlier determination of a circa 17 date to be remarkably accurate. As such, the Parson Barnett house can be definitively ruled out as a candidate for the identification of the Bradstreet house. Turning back to the garage, Dendrochronology samples were taken in both 2019 and 2021. In total, 30 samples from 19 different timbers were collected, representing a wide array of areas within the structure, including posts, beams, girts, studs, and joists. The study generated dates that determined the last set of trees used for lumber was felled in the winter of 1667 to 68, which gives a construction date of the building of 1668 or shortly thereafter. This date is well within the range of when the Bradstreets would have sought to replace their home that burned in 1666. From the rotated orientation and rejoined nature of many of the components of the 1668 Bradstreet structure, it is clear, however, that the house had been disassembled, moved, and reassembled at its present location. Furthermore, due to the humble size of the extant structure, it is likely that it only represents a partial component of the Bradstreet's house, which would have almost certainly been of grand style given their wealth and elite status. Both the move of the structure, as well as its partial nature, are supported by notes written circa 1850 to 1875 by William Gray Brooks during research he was conducting on his family's Phillips Manse property. Since its move, the structure has undergone further modification, much of it insensitive to its historic value, to convert it to a modern garage, although since the Asnoians' ownership, they have installed support structures to mitigate this earlier damage. The small size of the current structure and its 1668 date fuel two possible interpretations about the Bradstreet's post-fire replacement home. First, in June of 1667, documents show the Bradstreets purchased another house near to the site of their home that was destroyed the previous year. If they occupied this new house in 1667, then what of the 1668 dendrochronology date? The most likely explanation is that this newly acquired home was inadequate in size and or taste for the Bradstreets, and that the 1668 dated structural elements represent some or all of an addition that was incorporated into their new home. That said, the Bradstreets often bought and sold investment real estate, so it is possible that the 1667 purchase is a red herring in terms of reconstructing the history of Bradstreet dwelling places. If the 1667 property was merely an investment and was never or only briefly inhabited by the Bradstreets, then the 1668 building under study would simply represent one portion of a house that was entirely a new construction at the time. Regardless of the partial nature of the remnants of the Bradstreet 1667-68 home, the historical value of the structure that still stands today is highly significant due to its former occupants, as well as the fact that it is one of the oldest remaining wood-framed buildings in the country. Further, the daisy wheel inscribed door of the house, which is certainly of great age and may well be original, is a great rarity. Thank you.
So, what stories live in this house? We believe that this is where Anne Bradstreet spent the last years of her life, years marked by tragedy and profound grief. 3 family members died in quick succession, 2 grandchildren, Anne and Simon, as well as their mother, Mercy. In June 1669, when her 3-year-old namesake dies, Anne Bradstreet writes, quote, "With troubling heart and trembling hand I write, the heavens have changed to sorrow my delight," end quote. Only a few months later, in September 1669, the child's mother, Mrs. Mercy Bradstreet, dies at 28 from complications of childbirth. Sorrow compounds in the elegy when she describes her family tree. Quote, "I saw the branches lopped, the tree now fall. I stood so nigh, it crushed me down with all. My bruised heart lies sobbing at the root," end quote. Not 5 weeks later, and another death of a child. The grief that informed these lines once filled this house. 3 years later, in 1672, Bradstreet would follow her young family members in death. It is our hope that at times she found a measure of comfort in the home, and she found peace and ease under its eaves. After her death, her son Simon carefully searched the house for poems written in his mother's hand, found among her papers after her death. Here, Simon picked up the Andover manuscript, the book she started writing before her death, to pass down to her wisdom and story to her 8 children and grandchildren. The material was so important to her son Simon, he was moved to take up the pen and continue what she had started. As Meredith Marie Newman writes, quote, Simon copies a mix of poetry and prose from various other manuscript sources, including at least one other manuscript book, none of which is extant today, end quote. Thanks to Simon Jr.'s documentary efforts in this house, we have some of Bradstreet's most powerful poems, Verses Upon the Burning of Our House, Contemplations, To My Dear and Loving Husband, and For Deliverance from a Fever. Each poem in the Andover manuscript was written for and preserved by her family. But this house has other stories to tell. In 1672, mere weeks after Anne's death, Thomas Robin, an indigenous man, tribe not specified in court records, was tried and prosecuted, quote, for breaking into the house of the worshipful Mr. Simon Bradstreet, end quote, a case that was prosecuted in Simon Bradstreet's own Essex County Court. Simon was both plaintiff and judge. Though the purported housebreak was Thomas Robin's only offense and his first appearance in court, he, quote, was sentenced to be branded on the forehead with a letter B and to pay costs, 14 shillings, to the Andover constable, end quote. 3 years later, Thomas Robin had still not paid off his 14-shilling debt and was consequently sold into slavery, possibly transported to the West Indies for breaking into this house. Later, on June 24th, 1687, when Anne's son Dudley was proprietor of the house, a baby was born here, a healthy child of mixed race to mother Galionota, an enslaved woman, and father John Stacy, who was a white settler of the second generation. Very little in the textual records attests to their lives or their experiences. We only know that Stacy died too soon. At not quite 9 years old, he drowned in May 1696. What grief these rafters knew. Here, in 1698, during King William's War, a reckoning and reverberation of King Philip's War in Essex County, Dudley Bradstreet and his family were captured from the house. Quoting a local history, they were carried about 50 rods from the house and released unharmed. As local history holds, their lives were spared for some past good deed by a member of the Bradstreet family. The papers of the town, the land deeds, laws, and documents intended to give order to the colony, which were all in Dudley's house, were taken and destroyed by members of the Wabanaki Confederacy. Along with the people who walked through the doors of this house, the materials, the wooden planks, the posts and beams, have a backstory too. Once trees in the forest, the wood became a commodity through Simon's sawmill on the Merrimack River. Simon established the mill in 1644, 2 years before the purported founding of Andover. Not only was the wood used to build homes in the new settlement, it was also one of the most lucrative commodities in the colony. Simon built his wealth by exporting milled lumber back to England for the shipbuilding industry, and he also shipped lumber from North Andover to the British West Indies, where his namesake son was establishing himself as a planter and doctor. One record accounts, quote, 40,000 feet of good pine boards due to Simon Bradstreet to be transported to Barbados, one half for said Simon and the other half for freight, the pay to be in sugar, end quote. This wood from North Andover, Massachusetts, was likely used to build some of the many costly and stately houses in Bridgetown, Barbados. This lumber, milled in North Andover, grown from trees that shaded the Poet's Walk, trafficked the geography of the triangle trade. This wood testifies to the Bradstreet family's relationship to both indigenous land dispossession and enslavement, and their interlocking machinations. We might imagine that this house had sisters, made from the same trees, both nearby and in the Caribbean. We would like to investigate this scientifically with dendrochronology in the future. These stories remind us that the colonial house is a place of comfort and respite for some, and a site of power, oppression, and exclusion for others. Next, we turn to another Bradstreet home, with what remains of the house destroyed by fire in 1666. While Bradstreet mourns the destructive nature of fire in Verses Upon the Burning of Our House, archaeologically speaking, fire can also be an agent of preservation. When a house is destroyed by fire, it doesn't simply disappear. A scar remains in its stead, and if left undisturbed, elements of the home endure in the dirt. Unlike a house occupied for centuries that changes with its inhabitants, renovations, and new construction, a burned house is a snapshot of a moment in time, as every object inside the house is touched by fire in some way. Bradstreet's poem likewise seeks to preserve what was lost to fire. Before we turn to this house, I'll read a portion of verses upon the burning of our house, the lines that brought us to this place. In silent night, when rest I took, for sorrow near I did not look. I wakened was with thundering noise and piteous shrieks of dreadful voice. That fearful sound of fire and fire, let no man know is my desire. I, starting up, the light did spy, and to my God my heart did cry, to straighten me in my distress, and not to leave me succorless. Then, coming out, behold a space, the flame consumed my dwelling place. And when I could no longer look, I blessed his name that gave and took, and laid my goods now in the dust. Yea, so it was, and so 'twas just. It was his own, it was not mine. Far be it that I should repine. He might have all justly bereft, but yet sufficient for us left. When by the ruins oft I passed, my sorrowing eyes aside did cast, and here and there the places spy, where oft I sat and long did lie. Here stood that trunk, and there that chest, and there lay the store I counted best. My pleasant things in ashes lie, and then behold, no more shall I. Under thy roof no guest shall sit, nor at thy table eat a bit. No pleasant talk shall e'er be told, nor things recounted done of old. No candle e'er shall shine in thee, no bridegroom's voice e'er heard shall be. In silence ever shalt thou lie. Adieu, adieu, all's vanity.
Archaeological excavations. After conducting rough field survey of the current property in 2019 in search of depressed areas that could indicate a possible cellar hole of the Bradstreet's burned home, we came up empty-handed. Seeking other approaches, we then turned to records of the archaeological excavation that was carried out at the site in the 1960s by local amateur archaeologist and historian Forbes Rockwell. In several episodes from 1960 to 1963, Rockwell excavated 19 test pits of various shapes and sizes that often were backfilled on the same day they were dug. During the course of the excavation, Rockwell and his team, with occasional assistance from the more experienced avocational archaeologist Roland Robbins, uncovered an array of artifacts and features that gripped their interest and kept the project's momentum going. Most notably, the team exposed a portion of what they believed to be a hearth, which confirmed that they had found the remnants of an early dwelling. Rockwell was troubled, however, when he discovered two coins, one dated 1700 and another 1724, atop the hearth. As he professed in a letter to Roland Robbins on August 8, 1963, his quote-unquote interest dropped very sharply with the finding of the two coins, end quote, lamenting that, quote, these are hard to explain in a house that theoretically burned in 1666, end quote. 2 weeks later, Robbins responded by opening his letter with tish tish, admonishing Rockwell for letting two 18th century coins derail what Robbins saw as a site with otherwise ample evidence dating to the 17th century. Further test pits were then dug in the remaining days of August of 1863, but between Rockwell's waning interest in the site and challenges with continuing to obtain permission from the property owners, the excavation was soon abandoned. As we now believe, it seems that Rockwell made a methodological and interpretive error. He did not take into account bioturbation. The straightforward archaeological law of superposition maintains that as one digs into deeper layers of soil, the artifacts and features that are encountered are progressively older due to the fact that natural and cultural sediments build upwards over time. Ideally, archaeologists experience sites in this neatly ordered way. In reality, this is often not the case due to bioturbation, which is a taphonomical phenomenon which can lead to the natural mixing and or disturbance of archaeological deposits. In the case of our present site, the most likely culprits would be burrowing animals and the growth of tree roots. Because of the possibility of localized bioturbation, Robbins was wise to view the 18th century coins with caution and to instead look more broadly at the full suite of available evidence from their dig. Following this line of thinking, we believe that the hearth that Rockwell uncovered in the 1960s was deserving of further investigation as possibly belonging to the Bradstreet's home that was consumed by fire in 1666. Fortunately, many of Rockwell's notes, maps, and correspondences regarding the dig are on file at the North Andover Historical Society archives. Within these, we found a map triangulating the location of most of the excavation units in relation to the foundation of the Phillips Manse. Using these, we plotted out the original location of Rockwell's excavations and centered our own dig atop where we believed the hearth was located. Breaking ground in April of 2022, we set up a grid of 4 1-by-1 meter units with the plan of expanding from there should we be fortunate enough to find subsurface features to chase. We soon began, as hoped for, to uncover well-ordered bricks as shown in Rockwell's 1960s excavation maps. Expanding the dig to follow these bricks, as well as associated stones, we concluded the season in June 2022, having uncovered the entirety of not only a brick hearth, but the surrounding foundational stones for a chimney. 2 key observations could thus be made. First, the hearth was located at quite a shallow depth compared to the modern ground surface. Given that a hearth should at least partially collapse into the cellar of a structure whose floor either burned or gave way due to disrepair, the hearth's location just below ground level strongly suggests that there wasn't a cellar to fall into. Our ground-penetrating radar survey that we conducted on the site this past August also failed to detect evidence of stone foundations in the vicinity of the hearth. In other words, the hearth was part of an earth-fast structure. As opposed to digging a cellar hole and placing posts and sills atop a stone foundation, earth-fast construction involves inserting framing posts directly into the earth and placing sills atop the ground. This type of construction was a common approach to erecting post-medieval architecture in both England and New England, with the greatest evidence of such in the early to mid-17th century, with earth-fast construction waning in popularity towards 1700. Thus, the fact that the hearth we are excavating is from an earth-fast structure neatly corresponds with the chronology of the Bradstreet's home that would have likely been built after 1646 and before 1666. This interpretation is supported in the archaeological record by numerous comparative examples that exist for contemporaneously dated earth-fast structures in Massachusetts, including the Miles Standish House in Duxbury, the Nickerson Home in Chatham, the Great House in Charlestown, and the Chadbourne site in South Berwick, then Massachusetts. Sorry, Chad. Secondly, the orientation of the hearth also began to open a conversation about the possible layout or shape of the house and its overall alignment on the landscape. First period houses in mid-17th century Massachusetts most often took 2 general forms. The first, and by far most common, was a center chimney hall and parlor layout as shown on screen. At times, the biography of such houses began with an end chimney layout serving just one room down and up. But often a second side was later constructed to complete the center chimney, hall, and parlor footprint. The popularity of this layout is most simply attributed to the fact that it resembles houses found in and around East Anglia, England, the region where the majority of the first wave of immigrants who landed in Massachusetts originated. Less commonly, those hailing from the western part of England seem to prefer replicating the appropriately named one-room wide longhouse form that was more traditionally constructed in that region. Given that Simon Bradstreet migrated from Lincolnshire and Anne from Northamptonshire, both counties bordering on or sometimes included in East Anglia, it is unlikely that they would have chosen to construct a longhouse. Given the Bradstreets' immense wealth, both their first and second homes would likely have been substantial and perhaps would have exceeded the size of other still extant grandiose homes from the time period, such as the Judge Corwin, a.k.a. Witch House in Salem, the Saugus Iron Works House, or the Whipple House in Ipswich. It may have been more akin to one of, if not the largest extant 17th century home in New England, the House of Seven Gables in Salem. Although the early 19th century reconstruction drawing of the Bradstreet's other home, no longer standing in Salem, is hypothetical, if it is even somewhat accurate, the house would have been immense and highly ornate. In terms of the home's orientation and further considering form, Evidence available from our current excavation leaves open several possibilities, including a quintessential south-facing center chimney hall and parlor with or without rear summer kitchen, or an east-facing towards the nearby First Meeting House, center chimney hall and parlor plan. A less common layout is also possible, such as that seen at the Great House in Charlestown, which shares the general layout of a more common Massachusetts center chimney hall and parlor home, but instead features chimneys at both ends of a large structure, each with unidirectional hearths facing into the house. More excavation is necessary to address this key part of our inquiry, and our minds remain open to a variety of possible interpretations. Perhaps the key line of inquiry in our excavations has been to find evidence to support or refute the case that we are in fact dealing with the Bradstreet house that went up in flames in 1666. Unsurprisingly, the prime evidence we are seeking is a material signature of burning. Until this October, such clues have remained frustratingly elusive. Our 2022 excavations and those at the beginning of this past field season commonly revealed scattered charcoal, but not in the quantities that we had expected, nor had we uncovered much in the way of household items that seemed to have been exposed to fire or high heat. This fall, however, we began to find tantalizing evidence that we are, in fact, excavating the burnt remains of a home. Thank you.
Another point of frustration that had dogged our early investigations was trying to locate the materials that Rockwell and his team excavated in the 1960s. This fall, however, there was a breakthrough at the North Andover Historical Society when collections manager Robin Siegel located the objects recovered from the final 6 of Rockwell's 19 excavation units. You can see us here just so stoked to have found these. And if you look closely, and if the photo were dated, you can see that we recovered these on August 31st, 2023, and they were marked up on the bag, August 31st, 1963. So 60 years to the date that they were dug, we recovered them, which felt really special. So after we conducted a preliminary sort of the material, 2 suites of artifacts stood out to us as the first solid evidence of burning at the site. The first was a bag of charcoal that greatly exceeded anything that we had yet excavated, both in terms of size of fragments and their overall quantity. Secondly, we found a golf ball-sized blob of melted lead, as well as melted, twisted window leads, along with ample broken glass. Not only did these show evidence of having been exposed to fire, but leaded casement windows are a hallmark of post-medieval houses, such as the one that the Bradstreets would have inhabited.
Shortly after these finds at the Historical Society, our dig began to also reveal abundant evidence of burning. This had been most prevalent at excavation depths that would have been just below the house's floor level, which, given earth-fast construction, should represent the lowest place that burnt material could have fallen during a fire. Indeed, we exposed large masses of charred wood consistent with construction timbers and/or planks in several areas on both sides of the hearth. We were able to remove 2 pieces intact, the largest of which was stabilized along with its surrounding matrix using a plaster jacket. A melted cluster of lead and tacks was recovered towards the east end of our excavations. To the other side of the hearth, we found a highly ornamental metal object amidst a great deal of burnt material that is almost certainly either a book hinge or hinged from a small piece of furniture, such as a Bible box. As could be expected after a house fire, Anne Bradstreet bemoaned the loss of prized possessions. To re-highlight a portion of her poem read earlier by Christy, Anne recalled, quote-unquote, "When by the ruins oft I pass, my sorrowing eyes aside did cast, and here and there the places spy, where oft I sat and long did lie. Here stood that trunk, and there that chest, there lay that store I counted best. My pleasant things in ashes lie, and them behold no more shall I." With convincing evidence of mass burning appearing at the site, we have become confident that we are excavating the Bradstreet's home and are recovering the remnants of the lost treasures that Anne lamented. Other artifacts. Because excavations are still continuing, we have not even cleaned the majority of the artifacts we have recovered. let alone gotten them into a lab for further analysis. As such, we do not yet have a firm grasp on the full assemblage that the site has produced. That said, we would like to share a small selection of the material culture that have revealed themselves, some of which are also here with us this evening on the table here. To begin, we would like to revisit an object that needed no excavation, the door in the 1668 house. The door features 5 marks of note. The first, a carved daisy wheel, is significant for a number of reasons. The use of the daisy wheel and other related geometric designs has long been employed as part of European folk customs as a measure of white or counter magic used to ward off, or more accurately trap, evil spirits who threatened to enter a home. As such, these signs can most often be found on or around doorways, windows, hearth lintels, or other portals into the structure. Despite such folk beliefs in many ways running counter to fundamentalist Puritan doctrine, the heritage of counter magic folk practices had temporarily deep roots and were tolerated, even if informally, amongst Puritan settlers in New England. Indeed, the fact that the door under study may well be original to the Bradstreet 1667-68 replacement home could lend extra meaning to the daisy wheel prominently carved in its center. Given that the devil and his spiritual minions were held suspect in all manner of tragedies among the Puritans, it is a distinct possibility that the Bradstreets may have employed this daisy wheel as an extra safeguard to ward off any malignant spiritual forces that could have played a role in the conflagration that consumed their earlier home. Interestingly, a nearly identical door also exists elsewhere in the property and appears to have been removed from the structure at some point in the past. Now detached and stored in an outbuilding, the door exhibits the same type of angle-cut planks in its construction and features a compass-drawn circle in the center of the door akin to the other's daisy wheel. The second door, however, lacks the petals inside the circle, but still falls within the range of various counter-magic signs found in medieval and post-medieval European contexts.
Four other signs are also noteworthy on the first door, each of which appear to be lightly burned into the wood. One mark is clearly the letter S, which is followed by a less clear but still discernible B. It is tempting to identify these as the initials of Simon Bradstreet. Markings that resemble infinity signs are located above and below the hypothesized initials. Used in European mathematics since 1655, the infinity sign is something the Bradstreets may have been aware of by 1668. But we're still in the process of investigating the potential interpretations of this imagery. Over the course of excavations, we have uncovered thousands of artifacts. Given the continued occupation of the site from the 1640s to the present, a great many time periods are represented in the material culture assemblage. The uppermost layer contains 21st and 20th century trash, and no small amount of 19th and 18th century material was subsequently encountered below this. Although our primary focus is the Bradstreet period, these artifacts also tell rich stories of later occupants, including Samuel Phillips Jr., who coincidentally happens to be the founder of Phillips Academy, where Don teaches. But these stories will be told in due time. Although more research needs to be conducted on the earlier materials, we have recorded domestic items that may well have figured into the daily life for the Bradstreets, and their indentured and enslaved servants are beginning to emerge. So I'm going to talk about the hearth as a gathering place in front of a fireplace hearth right here. So we started our second field season at a fireplace hearth. Our study revealed an area of well-ordered bricks, the footprint of a fireplace, surrounded by large stones serving as the foundation of a chimney stack. Over the next several months, we encountered additional rows of ordered bricks at the southern end of our excavation, suggesting multiple hearths in the home. Further study is needed to reveal a clear picture of the number and layout of the hearths inside of the Bradstreet house. Some hearths may have been predominantly used by servants and others by Anne and Simon, and these hearths may have been situated in the parlor chamber, kitchen, or hall. In the colonial house, the hearth was a gathering place, where people connect in front of a fire to find warmth and maybe good food and good company too. This wasn't simply Anne Bradstreet's fireplace, but rather the very heart and center of a complicated home space, Many of our small finds testify to past experiences of connection and community. When we have encountered animal bones of all sorts, there's one over here, the possible pig bones, we learn a little more about the food people prepared and ate together. The possible pig bones and teeth, the chicken bones, speak to the foodways that sustained the people inside the house. The broken plates and vessels and saucers, some of our most common finds at the hearth, likewise recall scenes of eating and sharing food. These red wares, along with the sherds of Bellarmine and Westerwald vessels, would be right at home in the 1600s. The prominence of needlework and sewing tools among the bricks offer traces of women's experiences in the past. Sewing by the fireside illuminates the work at hand and warms the body of the seamstress. Did a mother and child, each fitted with a thimble, I have a small one for a child here and a larger here, did a mother and child, each fitted with a thimble, sit together and sew near the fire? The broken pieces of scissors, the pins and needles fallen between the bricks of the hearth, remind us of the people who shared space here and took up the needle and thimble to sew clothes and patch old ones. From the large adult thimble to the tiny one suited for a child, we have a testament of knowledge and skill being shared and passed between generations. Inside the home, at the same depth as the charred timber from the house fire, Isabella encountered this bone needle, likely of indigenous origin. The bone needle teaches us that the Bradstreets maintained trade with their indigenous neighbors and incorporated indigenous tools into their sewing practices. This lead seal was once applied to a bale of trade goods and was most likely affixed to a bulk shipment of fabric. Lead seals convey information about the circumstances of the textile's production, and further study and interpretation of this lead seal may further illuminate the Bradstreet's ties to global networks. Though Anne Bradstreet scorned each carping tongue who says my hand and needle better fits in the prologue of her book, there was, nevertheless, much sewing to do in the 17th century. No small amount of smoking seems to have been done in and around the house, as white clay pipes have been found in great quantities, as is commonly the case from historic New England sites. Some pipes' bore sizes and bowl features clearly hail from the 17th century. Music brought people together at the hearth, too. One of our earliest finds was a mouth harp, a portable and affordable music instrument with an otherworldly sound, evocative of historically distant musical practices and soundscapes. So this is the one we found, and this is a new one I bought myself because I just wanted to hear what this would sound like in the Bradstreet house. So this is my amateur mouth harp music. So, thank you. There it is. So we recently unearthed an 18th century sleigh bell, a delightful find that calls to mind Christmas and holiday music. In fact, one of the house's previous residents, Phillips Brooks, wrote O Little Town of Bethlehem from the main house on the property. For centuries, people drank, smoked, and sang in front of these bricks. For us, our whole team, the hearth has rekindled its purpose as a gathering place. We've shared stories and food. We have connected outside with our hands in the dirt to make sense of our shared past. Something burned here, and every day our team knelt upon the dirt and ashes to learn from it. Not all of the stories passing through the Bradstreets' homes are easy to tell. They are as complex and as deeply rooted as the site we are studying. We still have more to learn, more to dig, artifacts to analyze and study, to give a full account of the houses and their 17th century residents. But we have outgrown the simple stories of the earliest settlers of New England, of Plymouth Rock and the first Thanksgiving. And this home opens the door to a multitude of complex stories at the very roots of American culture. It is our work to find the language fit for such complexity and to tell the truth about the past.
I haven't advanced this one yet. Future work. At the conclusion of the fall field season, we began chasing a ground-penetrating radar signal that might indicate a subsurface disturbance consistent with the small storage cellar feature. We were unable to complete that excavation, but the stratigraphy or soil layering is clearly different than the rest of the excavation, which begs further investigation. More broadly, next season, we hope to expand the dig to continue to follow architectural features in the hope of gaining new insight into the size, structure, and overall footprint of the home. Although land deed records, earth-fast construction, 17th century artifacts, and a great quantity of burned evidence all build a convincing argument that we are dealing with the Bradstreet's home, we also hold on to hope that additional research will reveal an artifact with Bradstreet initials or a crest that would serve as a proverbial smoking gun for this identification. In conclusion, although the property itself and we in our investigations could not be more fortunate to have had such dedicated, collegial, and sensitive stewards of the Bradstreet site in the Asnoyans, change is in the air. After decades of caring for the property, the current owners are moving on to the next phase of their lives, and the house will be offered for sale this spring. With the future preservation of the property now in question, this is a unique opportunity to protect this significant multi-component site. To that end, Christy and I have established the Bradstreet Phillips Historic Preservation Trust to attempt to raise $2 million. More importantly, these funds would be used, or most importantly, these funds would be used to acquire the property, continue research, restore some components of the 1667-68 structure, and to preserve the site for future generations. Beyond this, we also have plans to establish the Phillips Manse as a center for the study of early New England that will host a steady stream of scholars and writers in residence. Christy and I would be delighted to discuss the trust or any other components of our work with you further. Thank you so much for coming this evening. It has been a real delight to be here with you. Thank you. So questions? We're happy
we would love to take
field
questions.
questions or commentary. Yes.
Basic question. I'm confused as to where the pre-1666 Bradstreet archaeological site is. On which side of the Bradstreet Road is it?
Yeah, well, it's going to take us a while to go back here, and for those of you listening online, the question is, where exactly is the house located? And this is actually a pretty good image here. So this is a drone shot. Osgood Street is facing northward this way, okay? This is the 1749 Phillips Manse. The excavation is going on here. So this is where the pre-1666 Bradstreet house would have been. And the garage is this very back end of the house here.
So they're really near each other.
They're all essentially, they're right on top of each other. So house 1, house 2, which likely existed back here on the property someplace, but we're not yet sure. But again, as we were talking about, it was moved and then buttoned onto this at some point after the manse was built in 1749.
And Barnard is right across the street.
Exactly, yeah. But Barnard House is like right here.
The
Yeah.
cemetery up over where we are.
Right, exactly. Yeah, this would have been, this house here roughly faces up towards the cemetery. This way a little bit further. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
With that, I'm just looking at this. Just the way it looks like it's laid out, if that's the north where the road is, it would appear then the side of the house faces the north, and the front of the house would face either east or west.
At this point, we have spent more time talking about this, dancing around the dig, looking at all the features. Right now, there are a number of competing hypotheses that we have right now. It's not entirely clear. I think probably the house either faced this way south, right, or it would have faced east like this. Right? If it faced east, it's facing up towards the town meeting house, which would make some sense in terms of just social orientation. But then, of course, most houses actually were oriented facing south at this time period, right? And depending on how the different hearths play out, we will be able to eventually determine what the orientation is. Right now, the primary hearth that we've shown a few different times here. Let's see if we can get back to that. Was it earlier here? Am I too early? I think I'm too early. Hold on one second. Let's see.
And
Oh,
why-
right here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
You
that's,
go ahead.
okay. I didn't want to cut you off. So if you look here, you can clearly see the outline of the chimney stack. And then you can have the nicely ordered bricks here. And the fact that this faces north, if the house would have faced south, this would be the summer kitchen. Right? This would have been in the lean-to in the rear of the house. But if that's the case, then we would expect, and I think if I can go forward a little bit further here, if you bear with me. If you look here, we would expect to find a hearth here and a hearth here for the hall and parlor. There's definitely ordered bricks going on here. Here, not so much. And even this is certainly not as well preserved as this. So one possible interpretation is that these bricks were robbed at some point and repurposed on the property. Who knows? Perhaps even to build the manse, the chimney and the manse. Certainly this material is closer to the manse, so this would have been the easiest stuff to grab. So it's within the realm of possibility. But the honest answer is we're still digging, and we don't 100% know yet.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I was going to add that's not entirely clear from the photos is that the house is situated on the top of a hill. So the Bradstreets, regardless of which way the house faced, they would have had a clear eye line on the town common, the burial ground, and the church. So they would have had a pretty good vantage to...
Regardless.
Yeah.
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 Yes, please.
Hey, Ophelia.
You were talking about there have been like some evidence about the undocumented personnel in the house. Recent scholarship shows that existence of these people, and I was wondering if there is like any evidence or artifacts in your excavation show us a little bit more about these people.
Yeah. I think we're hopeful that we can, kind of clarify some aspects of the chronology that might help us understand kind of who is interacting with these artifacts. I think we still have a lot of lab work to do to know kind of exactly where in the chronology of the site each of these artifacts fit, and then who was living in the house at the time, I think was changing quite often. But I think as we're recovering the names and kind of getting a sense of all of the people who lived in the house, I think some of the mission of the Colonial Society has been enormously helpful. The public availability of some of these older records, because you find names in court records. Essex County court records will mention some people by name. North Andover vital records will mention kind of births and deaths of enslaved people by name. So it's kind of looking for the pieces in places that you might not immediately expect, but we're still kind of putting the pieces together in a chronology that might help us understand whose things these are.
Right. I think too it is within the realm of possibility if we are able to ultimately get a good idea as to how the house was laid out. We might be able to identify certain spots that would be more consistent with servants operating in that particular space. And then if that's the case, we could try to look geographically within the dig and look at that particular assemblage and be able to identify some things that you could say, yeah, more likely used by enslaved folks, servants, and whatnot. Now, on the flip side, you can certainly look at something like this, right? And this is the polar opposite of what you're asking. This is some pretty fancy import material that we know is not the type of thing that enslaved people or servants would have been using unless they were serving something in it, right? So it's a little easier to identify this stuff. But it is within the realm of possibility to identify these things for underdocumented folks too, and that's part of the mission.
And the silver thimble, one thinks, would have to be Ian's or one of her daughters.
Yeah.
Has to be. Which is really...
Quite remarkable.
Yeah.
And then this is one of these other remarkable objects here. Perhaps, I think it's probably my favorite thing that we have uncovered so far, but this little piece of, potentially a book latch or a Bible box latch or something like this. And this came squarely from the burnt level. This was very likely one of the things that Anne was directly talking about in her poem. Yes,
Have you put that particular artifact online so other scholars, like in England or something, can find a similar one in the British Museum? Or
yeah,
we have a provenance that would corroborate your thoughts.
Yeah, that's. I mean, we will. We have not yet, but we will for sure. We have quite literally thousands. We have a stack of Rubbermaid tubs full of thousands of artifacts that we still need to process.
But like washing dishes.
Yeah.
Just a little dirty. Just a little dirty.
So we absolutely do plan to publish. We actually just launched a website that we'll make sure the QR code is up so people can scan that on the way out if you wish. But we just launched a website, and we'll be continuing to get some of our material up there as well. So.
And when does digging start this spring?
Well, May, if we don't want to trust the fiddly New England spring, probably May. Probably May. That's the hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.